Okay, so we are still in tissues, and in our last video, we learned or reviewed really that tissues are made of cells working together for a common function, and we learned that there are four general types of tissues. Epithelial tissue, which epi means above, so it's always on the surface, whether that's lining the inside of something or covering the outside of something. Connective tissue, which connects all the other tissues and does really a wide variety of functions. We learned about that there's muscle and nervous tissue. We also learned, focused on epithelial tissue and named them based on their shape, squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, and then bilayering, either simple, where there is just one layer, or stratified many layers, or more than one. With cuboidal and columnar, oftentimes there's just a couple. But we also looked at pseudostratified, columnar epithelial, and transitional epithelial, and looked at glands, because glands are always going to be found in epithelial tissue because they open up to a free surface. We also learned that the epithelial tissue has a basement membrane that it's attached to. And what lies usually right under that basement is this connective tissue. So generally, connective tissue, the cells aren't going to be as tightly packed as we saw with epithelial tissue. And there is what's called a matrix. And so there's this extracellular outside of the cell space between the cells. And that in that matrix, there's what's called a ground substance. So whatever like the background is, and then some protein fibers are found there. So all connective tissues have that ground substance and protein fibers. And this is the most abundant tissue you have in your body by weight. They can be fluid tissue and even solid tissue. And there's kind of two categories of connective tissue. There's connective tissue proper, which I think of are like the fancy name tissues that you've probably never heard of, maybe with the exception of one. And then there's specialized connective tissue, which you have heard of all of those. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. Connective tissue has for the most part, has a great blood supply, and we know as long as cells can get near blood, they can get oxygen and nutrients to repair and replace cells easily. There are some fixed cells. Anytime you say something is fixed, even in like microbiology, if you fix bacteria to a slide, you stick it there. So fixed means they stay in one space, and then some cells actually wander and they move throughout tissues, which is kind of weird to think about. And we'll talk about macrophages in a little bit. So what is that function of connective tissue? I said there were a lot of functions. Well, it connects things, so it binds things together. It provides support. It helps protect organs. It provides the framework for other tissues to stick to. It fills up space. It can store fat, which is a source of energy if you run out of sugar. Remember that. It can make blood cells. It can protect you against infection, and it can help repair any damage. And so fun to know, the extracellular matrix, we mentioned that, is this what helps anchor cells together. And they also play a role in communication and tissue repair. And so you can pause the video and read about cancer and how cancer can spread, about liver fibrosis, and then the connection between heart failure and atherosclerosis. So the major cell types of connective tissue are these three: the fibroblasts, the macrophages, and the mast cells. Now, fibroblasts are going to look like there's a bunch of fibers coming out, like a blast, like bang, in a comic strip of fibers coming out. And so that's going to be easy to recognize. They are the most common fixed cell. Remember that means they're anchored. They're kind of star-shaped, like a bang or bam would be in a comic book. And they secrete these fibers out into the extracellular matrix. The macrophages, we're not going to call them histiocytes, but macro means big and phage means to eat. Remember those phagocytosis. And so they're usually attached to these fibers, but they can detach off them and they can actually move around and do phagocytosis. And what are they doing? They're looking for anything that's foreign, like bacteria or infected cells, to gobble them up and eat them and get rid of them for us. And then mast cells, think of like the mast on a sail ship is huge. These are like, you can think it's kind of like massive, but mast cells are very large. They're widely distributed and they do a few things. They release chemicals. Heparin is one that helps you not blood clot all the time, which is great, especially if you're a frequent flyer like me on long flights. You want heparin in your body. And they also release histamine, which causes the inflammatory response. And histamine, some people might take an antihistamine. So you're working against the mast cell because your mast cells are kind of, overreactive. And so histamine is actually a good thing because it helps fight infection. But with allergies, you're fighting something that's really not dangerous. So those are your 3 types of cells. And here's pictures of them. So see how this kind of looks like a blast? So these are a fibroblast, easy to recognize. Macrophages are, here it is engulfing this other cell that it's going to digest with its lysosome. And then here's this huge mast cell, and it's going to be releasing chemicals. So remember that we said there's fibers in the extracellular matrix. Well, the fibroblasts produce these fibers, and there's collagen fibers, elastic fibers, also called yellow fibers, and reticular fibers. And you've heard of collagen before. These are really thick threads of protein that give strength and flexibility. They're a little bit elastic, and so we find these heavily in ligaments and tendons. Elastic fibers, as they're named, are stretchy. And so these allow things to change shape and then quickly return back to their shape. We see this in our respiratory air passages. So you can take a deep breath and change your elasticity of those passages. And then when you relax, they kind of bounce back to shape. And same thing in your vocal cords. Reticular fibers are very thin, and they actually branch off of collagen, and they're real delicate, and they just support. We find a lot of them in the spleen and liver. And so here's 2 of those, the elastic fibers or yellow fibers, and the collagen, the thick, strong fibers. And so here are the components of connective tissue, the cells, and then the fibers that are in the extracellular matrix. Remember, the ground substance is just the background, the other fluid or stuff that fills in the space around the cells and the fibers. Okay, so we said there's 2 categories. There's the proper, connective tissue proper, and then the specialized. Look at the specialized first. You've heard of cartilage, you've heard of bone, you've heard of blood. Those are easy to understand. There are specialized connective tissues, and that's why, because they're so special, they just called them by name, and we've learned them. The other ones, the proper ones, there's loose and dense. So loose connective tissues have fewer fibers, and they look kind of loose. So areolar, adipose, which is fat, and reticular. And then your dense, think of just packed with fibers, really strong, and we're going to have dense regular, so there's going to be a regular pattern. Dense irregular has an irregular pattern, and then elastic, which is going to be kind of stretchy. Now, we've heard of collagen, and so that is over 60% of the protein found in a lot of these connective tissues, and it is the large percentage of dry weight of your skin, tendon, and ligaments, major organs. And if you mess this up, you can have some major diseases like chondrodysplasia, where your collagen is asymmetrical and too wide, and so you're not able to grow well, and you're short and might have some deformities. Marfan syndrome, a little more common that I've heard of recently, is where you don't have enough of a protein called fibrillin. And So you have, it's like overgrowth of limbs, sunken chest, and even dislocation of the lens of the eye. All right, let's talk about our tissue proper, and this is specifically loose tissue. So areolar tissue is really thin and delicate. It doesn't have a lot of fibers. Remember, we're loose, connective proper tissue, and the cells are mainly these fibroblasts, and they're kind of in a gel-like matrix. They are found below subcutaneous. Remember, cutaneous membranes are your skin, so this is right below the skin or right below your epithelial layers, and they're able to nourish those cells above it. Remember, epithelial cells don't have blood connecting to them, so this areolar tissue can have capillaries running through it because it's so loose, right? And is able to nourish the epithelial cells above it. Adipose tissue or fat, unfortunately, I've got a little bit of extra of that, so I'm well insulated and cushioned. But these cells, remember, site means cell, and dip or adip is fat. So these are fat cells, and they are just filled with fat. And because they're so filled with fat, the nuclei actually gets pushed over to the side. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. We see this behind your eyeballs, around your heart, around major organs as a cushion. So if you do get a blow or you're a football player or boxer or something, your organs are protected. And then it's beneath your skin as an insulating layer. So here's the cartoon picture of areolar. So you can see it's pretty loose. There's a lot of, you can see the ground substance. You see the fibers in it. And this is like what it looks like under the microscope. And so, again, this is just found all over and is somewhat delicate, but helps nourish tissues around it. Look at this adipose. I mean, it looks super fat cell. There is a blood vessel going through that. There it is there in real life. But look at the little nuclei pushed over to one side. So these are really hard to look at them in the microscope because there's just not a whole lot to it. You don't see a lot of the ground substance. But this, if you can think about punching this, it would move and be gooey. And so that's why it's loose tissue. And then our other one is reticular tissue, and it has thin reticular fibers, which is why it's named reticular connective tissue. We see this in some of the walls of our internal organs. And then we go to the dense tissue propers. And so dense regular, I told you, is going to have a whole lot of fibers, and they're going to make a, they're a regular pattern. And so most of these cells are fibroblasts, really strong, can withstand some pulling. So think about where you need strength, where you need protection. On your dermis, of course, that's your outer layer. You want to be able to withstand some pulling and be strong. And then tendons and ligaments, right? Connecting bone to bone and bone to muscle. So they don't have a lot of blood supply because they're so dense. And so tendons, ligaments are slow to heal. And the dermis struggles to heal a little bit too, even though it's near blood. And so here, this is still loose. So you can see a lot of the ground substance, and then the fibroblasts are actually like right here. And so here's all the fibers, the reticular fibers. And so this one is reticular. It looks somewhat like areolar, but areolar doesn't have thick reticular fibers like the reticular does. Now look at how much fibers there are. Lots of collagen fibers. Here's one cell. You can see the nucleus kind of there. The cells are not easy to see here because it's mainly the strong fiber. So this is, again, tendon, ligaments, and a little bit of the dermis. And it has this regular wavy pattern compared to, let me just show you irregular. So look at irregular. It's still packed. It's hard to see the cells, but definitely not this nice, pretty regular pattern. Now, don't get stuck on blue and pink. Those are just based on the stains that they stained the tissue. You can stain tissues a number of different stains. So we already saw the picture of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it is real thick and looks random, and it has all these collagen fibers kind of interwoven, and this is also going to make up the dermis of the skin and be around some muscles. Now, our last one of the propers is the elastic connective tissue. And so these are, of course, going to be made of elastic fibers or the yellow fibers. And this is going to be found between your bone and of the spinal column, and then like places where you think need things to be stretchy, like parts of the heart. And so here is that elastic connective tissue. It has a lot of those fibroblasts and elastic fibers and collagen fibers as well. Okay, and now let's go to the specialized connective tissues, the ones that are easy, and honestly, I'm going to ask you more questions about. So we're talking about cartilage, bone, and blood. And what makes them kind of specialized is they have this really unique matrix and usually specialized cells. For example, cartilage is really a rigid connective tissue that allows a lot of support and protection, and it is what bone uses as a model. So when you are an embryo, you have a cartilaginous skeleton, and that cartilage is over time replaced with bone. And so that's pretty neat also. Chondra means cartilage. So I'm trying to think of a word besides chondrocyte right now. There will be one later. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But cyte means cell. So chondrocyte is cartilage cell. And they live in these little lakes called lacunae, or these chambers, these spaces. And so no blood supply, unfortunately. So not going to be able to heal cartilage easily. It is covered by perichondria. Remember, chondra means cartilage, and peri is around. It is a connective tissue, and it can provide a little bit of the nutrients. There are 3 types of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. So let's look at those. Hyaline is the most common one. So you want to star that, and you find this always on the end of bones. We'll see this show up again. We're going to call it articular cartilage later when we talk about bones, because articulate is to connect. If you're a good articulator, you help people connect what you're saying. So an articulation is a joint. And in that joint, you have 2 bones coming together, and you want to protect the ends of those bones so that they don't rub up against each other, right, and break the bone. And so that articular cartilage on the ends of the bones is made of hyaline cartilage. You find it on your nose. That's the end of a bone. Your respiratory passages. And remember, I told you your skeleton as an embryo was cartilage and was eventually replaced by bone. It was hyaline cartilage. So where do you find elastic cartilage? Remember, elastic is where it can bounce back. So think about your outside of your ear. You can easily bend it like in half, and then you let go and it bounce back into shape. And then fibrocartilage is your shock absorber. This is the most tough. It has a lot of those strong fibers, and this is where you're going to find, like, if it's a shock absorber, where are you putting most pressure? And so think about every day that we walk and stand and sit and fall down, our intervertebral discs are cushioned with fibrocartilage. You have a menisci of your knee, that's fibrocartilage. And then in your pelvic girdle, where there's just a lot of pressure and we need extra cushion there, if you will. So this is what hyaline cartilage looks like. Hyaline actually means glass. And so it looks glassy under the microscope. It's really a beautiful tissue to look at. These are the lacunae, the little lakes, and then the cells inside are the chondrocytes. And then this is that matrix. And then here is our elastic cartilage with a bunch of elastic fibers. And then your fibrocartilage with your big collagen fibers, and it looks more dense and strong to me. And this looks stretchy to me. Okay, so we've talked about our specialized tissue called cartilage. Well, what about bone? And ossi or os is always going to mean bone. And so osseous tissue is bone tissue, and it is the most rigid. It is a solid matrix. So we don't have a gel-like matrix. We have a solid matrix, and it's made of calcium salts and a bunch of the collagen fibers. So kind of weird matrix there. That's kind of why it's specialized. And it does support structures, right? It holds you up, but it is also going to protect your brain and your spinal cord and your lungs, major organs, and it produces blood cells in the bone marrow. It stores calcium as calcium salts, but it also stores phosphorus, and as you need more of that in other places, it can release that into the blood. And this is, of course, where our skeletal muscles are attached so that we can move our bones and form our skeleton and walk around. Osteo is also means bone. You've probably heard of osteoporosis or holes in the bone. Well, osteocytes are bone cells. They also live in lacunae like our cartilage did. And we have two types, compact bone and spongy bone. Now, we could go into a little bit of this, but honestly, we're going to have a whole unit on bone. And so I want you to just read over this, see that osteo and compact and spongy, but put it in short-term memory, and then, you'll be able to recall it a little bit, or it'll at least sound familiar when we study bones, but you do not need to know that for the test. But this is kind of what bone tissue looks like under the microscope. Very easy to recognize. And then you have blood, which is real weird because it's not a solid matrix. It's not a gel matrix. It's a liquid matrix. And the matrix of blood is what we call plasma. And all the formed elements are floating around in it. And there are 3 of those. There's red blood cells and white blood cells, and then pieces of blood cells called platelets that help in clotting. Red blood cells are mainly made for carrying oxygen and a little bit of CO2 for you, and then white blood cells are part of your immune response. And so blood transports stuff around the body. It transports nutrients, it transports calcium phosphorus, like we saw if it left the bone, it would go into the blood and go all over the body. Hormones and all kinds of things are transported throughout the body. And this is what blood looks like under the microscope. Now, blood, maybe you don't know, it has a biconcave disc, so it dips in on either side. And so the middle here is very thin. And that's why when you look under the microscope, you can see the light going through that. There's not an actual hole in the cell. It's just a thinner point. If you could take a pancake and pinch it in the middle part would be thinner, and that's why you're seeing light go through here. I can't see a good side view of blood, but it would look like this. Now, this is a white blood cell. White blood cells are generally larger than red blood cells, some of them much larger, and then platelets are little fragments of the cells that would help with clotting. And so here are all the connective tissues. There's just as many as there were in epithelial tissue, and these are harder for me to learn because they just have these weird names, especially the propers, right? But adipose, if you eat a bunch of dip, you're going to be fat. Areolar, not on a nipple, but this loose tissue that's delicate and helps bind organs is areolar. And then reticular helps support other organs. And then you have dense, regular, dense, irregular, and then that elastic stuff. Then we went into the specialized tissues like our cartilage, bone, and blood. So I would star this. This would be, one a picture I would print, right, and put next to my epithelial tissue. So we need to talk about membranes there, and I don't know why right here they're talking about membranes, because there are epithelial membranes. But they're also, I see why, because there's a little bit of connective tissue associated with it. Sorry. So there's serous membranes, which these should be easy. There's 3. Serous membranes are super easy because we've already learned them. Remember, we talked about visceral and parietal pericardium, or visceral and parietal pleura. Those were serous membranes. And these membranes line body cavities that are internal. So around the heart, the body cavity that holds your gut, and then the part that holds your lungs in the thoracic cavity. And so it is a combination of simple squamous epithelial with areolar tissue, and it is able to secrete, remember, in between the two, the visceral and the parietal, they're going to secrete fluid, and that reduces friction of those things as that organ moves. So serous, I think of, man, it'd be a serious issue if you could touch that, because that means part of your body cavity that should be inside is exposed to the outside. Mucous membranes, however, you can touch. You've probably touched mucus before. You see this lining your respiratory, so up in your nose, in your mouth, digestive system, urinary. Don't put your finger there. Reproductive tracts, do you? But mucous membranes are lining cavities that are actually open to the outside. So I think about mucus is where you could touch mucus. Serous membranes, no. And it is epithelial tissue and areolar connective as well. We'll have some goblet cells to make that mucus. Remember those. And then we said there's cutaneous membranes. Says there's three. Cutaneous membrane, covers the outside of the body. Remember, you could look really cute, or it's easy to cut your skin. This is your skin. Cutaneous, you look cute with your skin. You'd be ugly without it. And then synovial membranes are a little different because they are just connective. So star synovial, that's a weirdo, and you're going to find them in joints like the knee. My dog is snoring. And then she stopped when, oh my gosh. Pretty girl, but she snores like a man. Okay, let's talk about muscles. Remember, muscles are able to contract. And when you contract your muscle, you actually bring those fibers, make them shorter, and that's why your muscle gets thicker. There's 3 types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And I usually ask a lot of questions on these. So star muscle tissue. So skeletal muscle tissue is attached to bones, which is why it's called skeletal. And it's striated. That means it has these stripes, these ridges on them. You'll be able to see them in the picture. I'll point them out to you. It is a voluntary muscle. You choose to move it for the most part, right? So like right now, you're choosing to move your eyes, or you're choosing to move your hand as you pause the video and write something down. It's voluntary. These cells are going to be super long. In fact, they go all the way from origin to insertion. So think about your bicep of your arm. Put your finger on your shoulder. That's where your bicep, it's a 2-headed muscle, which is why it's called bicep, is attached to your scapula, okay? I said that wrong. Your clavicle. Okay. So, your bicep is attached to your shoulder, and it runs all the way down. Follow your finger down your bicep to your elbow. Y'all, that's one cell. It's one cell that goes the whole length of that. And it's just a bunch of them attached together. Remember, we're talking about tissues, and tissues are made of cells. So the cells are very, very, very long, and they're kind of cylindrical in shape. And because they're so long, you need many nuclei in them. So they're going to have more than one nucleus per cell. Kind of weird. Remember, structure determines function. We need that whole cell to be super long so that they attach one bone to another, and when it shortens, it moves the bone towards the origin. And we stimulate them by nerve cells. The nerves tell these muscles to move. And so this is what it looks like. Notice this is one cell. They're also called muscle fibers. I hate that word because cell and fiber to me aren't the same thing. But this is a muscle cell or a muscle fiber, and you can see the little stripes on it, the striated. So the striations are there. And then, I clicked. This is one nucleus, and this is a second nucleus in the same cell. And you can see on this one, and the nuclei are kind of pushed to the outside because these cells are going to be made filled with organelles of fibers so that we can pull bones and move them. And so this is what it looks like under the microscope, and you can see those ridges. And if you were to touch this, if you were to rub your finger on this, it would be kind of bumpy, kind of like when you drive your car on a road that's been like has a washboard effect. Smooth muscle is non-striated, which is why they named it smooth. So if you're driving a car on a road and it's really smooth, there's none of those bumps in it. So you're not going to see those stripes. These are not cylindrical. They're more spindle shaped. So they come to a point on either end. They can be pretty long, but they can also be pretty short. So we don't talk about their size too much. But we find these in the walls of our hollow organs and our blood vessels. And so this is like all the way through your digestive system is smooth muscle, because it's going to contract to move the food particles, the food stuff, to the stomach. The stomach's going to be made of smooth muscle. The stomach's going to squeeze that chyme out of the stomach and through the small intestines. The small intestines are going to move that to the large intestine. So you have all this smooth muscle working. And you don't have to think about it. It does it, you don't have to go, okay, stomach, time to, churn this food. It does it by itself. Cardiac muscle is only found in the wall of the heart. So that's why it's called cardi. And it's weird. We have actually seen these cells earlier. Remember, we were surprised by their shape because they actually branch. They are also striated. So you're going to see those stripes. They're not smooth. So there's only one that's smooth and the other two aren't. And then it is involuntary. Thank goodness, because, me, I have short memory, or not memory, but attention span, and so I would forget to tell my heartbeat and I would die. So thank goodness we don't have to choose to do this. It does it on its own. And what's most unique about cardiac muscle is it has these intercalated discs, which are gap junctions actually between the two branching cardiac muscle cells. So let's look at a picture of these. So smooth muscle, very different from these striated muscles. Notice this has the stripes too, like our skeletal muscle. This does not. And it's kind of more of a spindle shaped. And so it looks smeared. It looks smooth. And this is what's working all through your digestive system and other hollow organs and blood vessels. Now here's what's in our heart, the cardiac muscle. And you can see that it's branching. It does only have one nucleus. These only have one nucleus. So what tissue has two nuclei? That would just be these skeletal muscle cells. These all have just one nuclei. And then in between these, you see these like bolder stripes on them? Those are the intercalated discs. And you can see them in the microscope here. These are all rigid. You have to look real close to see the stripes. I think this is zoomed in more, a higher objective, but you can definitely see all the intercalated discs that are gap junctions between these two cells, allowing the movement of material very quickly from one cell to the other. And then what happens is your heart kind of beats as one tissue instead of individual cells. Our last type of tissue is nervous tissue, found in your brain, spinal cord, and the nerves that come off of them. And the two main types of cells you need to worry about are neurons, which are the main cells, and then neuroglia, the cells that support the neurons and help nourish them. The neurons are made of three main parts: the soma, the dendrites, and the axon, and it's all about bringing information in, interpreting it, and deciding what to do with it. So that's communication between the cells. So here's this neuron. Here's the cell body, the soma. Here's the nucleus found in the cell body. Here's the dendrites coming off to receive information. Here's the axon that will send the information to the appropriate muscle or gland that it's talking to. And then all around it are these support cells, what we call neuroglia or glia. And so here's the, nuclei of those smaller cells. And you can read about progenitor cells and donor organs, and how they grow tissue. And here is a table of muscle and nervous, and that is the end of chapter 5. So you'll have a lab and you'll have a practice over this material to help you for your Unit 2 test.